In this episode, we're going to focus on internal requirements, because beginners often assume governance is driven mostly by external regulators or industry rules, when many of the strongest governance needs come from inside the enterprise itself. Internal requirements are the expectations, constraints, and commitments the organization creates for its own operations, such as how it wants decisions to be made, how it wants risk to be managed, what level of service reliability it promises, and how it protects information even when the law does not explicitly force it to. These requirements force governance decisions because they shape what must be controlled, who must be accountable, and what evidence leaders need to feel confident that the enterprise is operating responsibly. If internal requirements are unclear, governance becomes inconsistent, and control needs emerge late as painful surprises. If internal requirements are identified and made explicit, governance can design controls and decision paths proactively, making the organization more predictable and less reactive. The goal here is to help you recognize the common internal drivers that create governance obligations and to show how those drivers translate into controls without turning the episode into technical implementation. By the end, you should be able to explain how internal requirements arise, why they matter, and how they shape governance decisions about priorities, authority, and oversight. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful place to start is defining what an internal requirement is, because it is not simply a preference or a nice-to-have. An internal requirement is a rule or expectation the enterprise adopts because it supports its strategy, protects its operations, or reduces risk, and it is treated as something that must be satisfied for the organization to operate effectively. Some internal requirements come from leadership commitments, such as a promise to customers about reliability or privacy. Some come from internal policies, such as how access to sensitive data must be approved or how changes to critical systems must be reviewed. Some come from enterprise standards, such as required ways of classifying information, retaining records, or managing vendors. Others come from operational realities, such as the need to keep core services available or to ensure that employees can do their jobs without frequent outages. The key beginner idea is that internal requirements are self-imposed constraints that the enterprise must govern just as seriously as external rules, because failing to meet them can damage trust, create financial loss, and weaken the enterprise's ability to execute its strategy. Internal requirements become governance issues when they affect enterprise-wide behavior and require consistent decision-making. When you understand that, you stop treating governance as something imposed from the outside and start seeing it as a leadership choice to run the organization responsibly. Internal requirements often originate from enterprise strategy, because strategy is a set of choices about what the organization will prioritize and what it will commit to delivering. If the strategy emphasizes customer trust, the enterprise may adopt internal requirements around data protection, transparency, and service reliability that go beyond minimum legal expectations. If the strategy emphasizes operational efficiency, the enterprise may adopt internal requirements around standardization, reuse of shared services, and disciplined portfolio management to avoid waste. If the strategy emphasizes innovation speed, the enterprise may adopt internal requirements that define how to move quickly while staying within risk guardrails, such as clear exception handling and defined thresholds for escalation. These strategy-driven internal requirements force governance decisions about where to centralize authority, what standards to enforce, and what measures leaders must review. Without identifying these requirements, governance can drift into generic best practices that do not fit enterprise direction. For beginners, a useful test is to ask what the enterprise promises to deliver and what must be true for that promise to be credible. Those truths become internal requirements, and governance turns them into decision rules and control needs. Another major source of internal requirements is the enterprise's risk appetite and risk tolerance, which are leadership choices about what levels of risk are acceptable. Even if beginners have not heard these phrases before, the concept is simple. Every organization must decide how much uncertainty and potential harm it is willing to accept in pursuit of value. Internal requirements appear when leaders decide certain risks cannot be accepted without special approval, such as risks that could cause major outages, major financial loss, or serious reputational damage. For example, an enterprise might adopt an internal requirement that critical services must meet defined availability and recovery expectations, because the business cannot tolerate extended downtime. It might adopt a requirement that high-risk security issues must be addressed within certain timeframes, because leadership has decided those exposures are unacceptable. These requirements force governance decisions about how changes are approved, how issues are escalated, and how accountability is assigned for remediation. They also force control needs, because the enterprise needs mechanisms to monitor risk indicators and to ensure corrective actions occur. Beginners sometimes assume risk decisions are technical, but internal risk requirements are governance decisions because they define what the enterprise will accept and who is authorized to accept it. When you hear scenario questions about unmanaged risk or repeated incidents, consider whether internal risk requirements were missing, unclear, or unenforced. Internal requirements also come from service commitments and operational expectations, because enterprises depend on IT services that must be reliable enough to support business processes. Even when there is no external rule, internal expectations often require controls for availability, performance, change stability, and incident response. If the organization promises customers that a service will be available most of the time, it creates an internal requirement to manage reliability and resilience as governance outcomes. If employees must access systems to do their work, the enterprise has an internal requirement to maintain usability and support, because productivity loss is a real cost. These expectations force governance decisions about priorities, such as whether to invest in resilience improvements or to accept the operational risk of aging systems. They also force control needs, such as monitoring, oversight of change risk, and clear ownership for service performance. Beginners sometimes think controls exist only for compliance, but internal service commitments create control needs because the enterprise must ensure the services actually meet expectations. When governance embeds these requirements, leaders can balance feature delivery with stability rather than treating stability as an afterthought. In exam scenarios that mention recurring outages or unstable changes, internal operational requirements are often the true driver of what governance should strengthen. Information and data handling is another area where internal requirements are powerful because enterprises rely on data quality and consistency even when regulators are not involved. An enterprise may create internal requirements for data classification, data ownership, data quality standards, and how data is shared across departments. These requirements force governance decisions because data crosses organizational boundaries, and inconsistent handling creates confusion, poor reporting, and poor decision-making. If one department defines a customer differently than another, the enterprise cannot measure performance accurately, and strategy decisions become unreliable. Internal data requirements also shape controls, such as requiring that access to certain data types is approved and reviewed, or requiring that critical data changes follow defined processes. Beginners often assume data issues are technical, but many data failures come from governance gaps, like unclear ownership and inconsistent standards. Governance identifies data as an enterprise asset and assigns responsibilities for its stewardship, ensuring that the organization treats data quality and integrity as outcomes worth protecting. When you see scenarios involving inconsistent reporting or conflicting metrics, internal data requirements are often the missing piece. A governance framework that identifies these requirements can prevent entire classes of enterprise confusion. Financial management and budgeting practices also generate internal requirements that force governance decisions, because money allocation is one of the strongest governance levers. Enterprises typically establish internal requirements about how investments are justified, how business cases are evaluated, and how benefits are tracked after spending occurs. These requirements exist to prevent funding decisions from becoming political or impulsive and to ensure the organization gets value from its limited resources. If the enterprise requires that major investments include a clear statement of expected benefits and risks, governance must enforce that requirement before funding approvals occur. If the enterprise requires that benefits are reviewed after delivery, governance must ensure that review happens and that corrective actions are taken when benefits do not appear. These requirements create control needs like standardized evaluation criteria, portfolio oversight, and transparent reporting. Beginners sometimes think budgeting is separate from governance, but in GEIT, budgeting and investment oversight are central because they shape what the organization can do and what it chooses to do. When internal financial requirements are weak, organizations often deliver projects that look successful but do not improve enterprise outcomes. Identifying financial requirements helps governance design the processes that keep spending aligned to strategy and evidence-based. People and organizational structure also drive internal requirements, because governance must work with the reality of how work is distributed across the enterprise. Internal requirements often include separation of duties, role clarity, training expectations, and approval boundaries designed to prevent errors and abuse. For example, an enterprise may require that no single person can both approve and execute certain high-impact actions, because concentration of power increases risk. It may require that certain roles receive training on policies and standards, because untrained decision-makers can create uncontrolled exceptions. It may also require that responsibilities are defined for services and information assets, because accountability cannot be enforced when ownership is unclear. These requirements force governance decisions about role assignment, authority thresholds, and escalation paths. They also force control needs, such as ensuring that approvals are recorded and that access is reviewed periodically. Beginners may think these are human resources issues, but they are governance issues because they affect how decisions are made and how controls are sustained. When a scenario involves repeated mistakes or unclear accountability, internal people-related requirements are often missing or not enforced. Governance must therefore identify and integrate these requirements into its framework. Internal requirements also emerge from technology realities, especially when the enterprise carries legacy systems, complex integrations, and vendor dependencies. Even if the enterprise wants to modernize quickly, the reality of fragile systems can create internal requirements around change control, testing expectations, and staged modernization plans. For example, an enterprise may adopt an internal requirement that changes to critical systems follow stricter review and scheduling, because downtime is unacceptable. It may adopt standards for integration and architecture coherence to reduce complexity over time. It may require that technology choices align with enterprise architecture principles to avoid creating new islands of technology. These requirements force governance decisions because they determine what kinds of technology choices are allowed and what exceptions must be escalated. They also create control needs, such as oversight of architectural exceptions and monitoring of technical debt trends. Beginners sometimes interpret technology constraints as excuses, but in governance they are inputs that shape realistic rules for decision-making. A governance framework that ignores technology realities often fails because its requirements cannot be followed without harming the business. Identifying technology-driven internal requirements helps governance create guardrails that protect stability while still allowing progress. A critical skill is translating internal requirements into control needs without confusing controls with punishment. Control needs exist because the enterprise must be able to rely on consistent behavior, and controls are the mechanisms that make that behavior predictable. If the internal requirement is that risk acceptance must be explicit, a control need might be that risk decisions are documented and reviewed at defined intervals. If the internal requirement is that investments must align to strategy, a control need might be that funding approvals require mapping to strategic objectives and review of expected benefits. If the internal requirement is that data must be handled consistently, a control need might be that data ownership is assigned and that changes to critical data definitions follow an approved process. Controls can be technical, procedural, or organizational, but the governance focus is on ensuring they are sustainable, owned, and monitored. Beginners often assume controls slow things down, but good controls can increase speed by reducing uncertainty and rework because people know what is expected and do not have to negotiate expectations every time. The exam often rewards answers that use controls as governance mechanisms to support internal requirements. rather than treating controls as add-ons. The key is that controls exist to protect objectives, not to create paperwork. It also helps to understand how internal requirements can conflict, because governance must reconcile competing needs. For example, an internal requirement for speed can conflict with an internal requirement for stability, and governance must define when speed is allowed to override stability and when it is not. An internal requirement for cost reduction can conflict with an internal requirement for resilience, and governance must decide what minimum resilience is non-negotiable. An internal requirement for autonomy in business units can conflict with an internal requirement for enterprise standardization, and governance must define boundaries and exception processes. These conflicts are normal and do not imply failure, but they do require explicit governance decisions so teams are not forced to improvise. Clear internal requirements make these conflicts visible, and governance can then set priorities and trade-off rules that align with enterprise direction. Beginners sometimes search for a perfect set of requirements that never conflict, but mature governance accepts that trade-offs exist and designs decision mechanisms to handle them. On the exam, when scenarios describe recurring conflict and inconsistent decisions, the underlying issue is often that internal requirements were not identified and prioritized. A strong governance response is to clarify requirements and define how trade-offs will be resolved. Finally, internal requirements must be made visible and communicated, because a requirement that only a few people know cannot shape enterprise behavior. Visibility includes documenting requirements in policies and standards, but it also includes integrating them into decision criteria and operating rhythm so people encounter them naturally when making choices. For example, if an internal requirement is that major changes must consider compliance and resilience, then change decisions should include those considerations as normal inputs. If an internal requirement is that benefits must be tracked, then governance forums should routinely review benefit realization as part of oversight. Communication also matters for adoption, because people follow requirements more willingly when they understand the purpose and how it connects to enterprise goals. If requirements are presented as arbitrary rules, people will seek exceptions and workarounds. If they are presented as guardrails that protect the enterprise and enable success, they are more likely to become default behavior. Beginners should recognize that internal requirements are strongest when they are embedded, not when they are merely announced. Governance, therefore, includes not only identifying requirements, but also integrating them into the system of decision-making and oversight. To close, identifying internal requirements that force governance decisions and control needs means recognizing that many governance drivers come from the enterprise's own strategy, risk appetite, service commitments, data expectations, financial discipline, organizational structure, and technology realities. These internal requirements shape what governance must control, who must be accountable, and how decisions must be made to keep the enterprise aligned and reliable. Once identified, requirements must be translated into sustainable controls that produce predictable behavior and credible evidence, not into punitive obstacles. Internal requirements also must be prioritized and reconciled when they conflict, because trade-offs are unavoidable and governance exists to manage them explicitly rather than by improvisation. When internal requirements are visible and embedded into decision criteria and operating rhythm, governance becomes proactive, and the enterprise experiences fewer surprises, fewer recurring failures, and more consistent value delivery. In the next episode, we will expand this lens to external requirements that reshape governance priorities and obligations, because good governance must balance what the enterprise chooses internally with what the world demands from the outside.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.